Thank you so much for the introduction. I'll make a quick warning. I'm experiencing thunderstorms, so I hope my internet holds. But anyway, I'm excited to share with you my journey to success of bioinformatics story. So just a little bit about me and where I am right now. I'm currently the Director of Training for the Institute of Cyber-Enabled Research at Michigan State University in the United States of America. I started my position last February, and I'll talk more about it in a few minutes. I'm also the founder and principal investigator of the Harris Interdisciplinary Research Group, which I started back in 2015, and we'll talk about also in a few minutes. I'm also the elected Michigan branch representative for the American Society for Microbiology, and I sit on their Council of Microbial Sciences, where I'm on a board that advises the Microbiology Society on how to act, everything from enacting public health legislation for the COVID pandemic through antibiotic resistance research, funding, etc. So since I'm going to be sharing my overall story and how I got here and where I hope to go a bit, I thought it would be helpful to do just a general overview or timeline of my career. So you'll notice that my career started in the wet lab as an experimental biologist. I started with a bachelor's of science in microbiology, and I started working with Petri dishes. In the course of doing my master's, I ended up switching to a bioinformatics approach, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so then my master's of science in microbiology had both an experimental and a computational component. Once I got my master's, I went to work for industry. So I worked for things like anthrax vaccine development. I worked for Pfizer, but I didn't work on COVID there. I worked on preclinical dermatology compound development, so working with pigs and mice and other animals. Then I went back to graduate school. I'll talk about how that went, but I ended up getting a second master's in cell and molecular biology, and that was entirely experimental. I then went to teach. So I became a biology instructor, both lecture and in the lab. And I did that for several years before I decided I wanted to revisit computers. Then I did teaching and computers for a while before I eventually transitioned to computers altogether. So let's go into my story in a little more detail. It all started back in the late 90s. I was a student at Michigan State University, where I work now. I actually work in the same building, just on the first floor. I was fourth floor before. My goal back then was to attend medical school. I wanted to become a medical doctor, and I wanted to work with patients. So as I wanted to do that, I started as an intern at a local hospital. Once I got back to MSU after my internship, I met Dr. Julius Jackson. He was a professor in one of my undergrad classes, and he was one of the few faculty at the time that was interested in both experiment and computation. And I found that interesting. So he recommended that as a backup in case I did not get into medical school, and spoiler alert, I did not get into medical school, that I enroll in this combined bachelor's and master's program. So I did, and I chose him as my mentor. So we started, as I mentioned a minute ago, looking at Petri dishes in the lab. But then we figured out that the degree requirements did not need an experimental component, and so we transitioned into the computation world. So as I mentioned earlier, my master's in microbiology was both experimental and computational. Then I went to work. So as I said, I started with Bioport, who's now called Emergent Biosolutions. And I was doing research and development for the anthrax vaccine. Back then, they had some issues making sure the vaccine was consistent and that people were getting consistent number of attenuated microorganisms in each dose. So I helped standardize things. After a couple of years, I moved on to Pfizer, where I was a scientific project associate. So I was no longer at the bench, but I was directing people on how to do bench work. And my goal when I left Pfizer was to go get a PhD in an experimental biology field and go back to Pfizer and become a full-fledged study director, not just an associate. So I went back to Michigan State and I signed up to be a graduate assistant in cell and molecular biology. But then I had my firstborn. And I chose this Elon Musk quote: once you have a family, you start taking risks not for yourself, but for your family as well. And it gets much harder to do things that might not work out. And this picture is extremely powerful to me because this was taken by my husband. And he said this was how he found me most nights. I would come home from the lab trying to work on my PhD, and I would be so exhausted between lab work and studying for qualifying exams that I would just pass out on the couch with the baby. And he would see me like this night after night, and it got draining. And I felt like I wasn't doing right by my kid. So I eventually said, you know what? This isn't working. I need to take a step back. And so I dropped out of that doctoral program and I got my second master's. And at the time, my mentor told me, if you drop this PhD program, you will never become a doctor. And I told her that's a risk I'm willing to take. She's now my coworker. So here I am. I am no longer in a PhD program. I don't have a job and I have a crying, hungry newborn. What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to teach online because that way I can have a flexible schedule and I can be home with the kid when the kid needs me. So I started working online as a part-time instructor with the University of Phoenix, who's one of the in the United States. I worked there for several years part-time and my kids grew. And so I decided, well, I can teach more than one class. And so I started working at other places. I started working in person on campuses. And then I got promoted to lead faculty area chair. I was actually over 2 divisions, health and science. And then at that point, I switched to Davenport University, where I started as a part-time adjunct teacher and a part-time science lab coordinator. I'll talk about that in a second. But eventually they had to hire me in full-time because of too many hours between 2 part-time jobs. And that was awesome, but it was stressful because I hadn't had a full-time job in a good 5-6 years. I didn't know I wanted to go back. I didn't know how it was going to affect my kids. It stressed me out. But I was encouraged to go back, and I'm glad I did. So when I came to Davenport University, also called DU in the abbreviations here, at Davenport, we had main responsibilities. So I was a teacher. I taught 24 or more credit hours per year. So usually 3 lectures and 2 labs in the fall, 3 labs, 2 lectures in the spring. I'd also usually work in the summer teaching overload for extra money. I also was responsible for preparing the campus laboratory classes. So making sure all the laboratory classes had the proper supplies. The supplies were clean, they were set out, they were disposed of properly, that stuff. For promotions, I had to get a terminal degree, which means going back and getting either a PhD or an ED. And most of my coworkers were getting PhDs or EDs in education fields, things like educational leadership. I wasn't really interested in that because remember, back in the day, I went to PhD to become a study director. And I knew in order to become a study director, I would need to have a PhD in a STEM or a science, technology, engineering, math field, not in education. But Davenport was a teaching college, not a research college. Michigan State is a research college. And so they didn't require that. I was kind of the oddball out. Additionally, I had to do professional responsibility. So I had to write papers. I had to try to do some research. I had to sit on committees, and I had to go to conferences and all of that stuff, give talks. And so these were my requirements for promotion. And so I set out to get my PhD again. And I also set out to be a study director. But the challenge was I had no money, $0. But I had a computer, and that was free. And I remembered from Dr. Jackson's lab all those years ago, you can do a lot with a computer for free. So I started doing computer work. I went and took a Coursera class for $50. I learned Python programming, and I started developing my skills and my research. And my excitement in doing that caught on to my students. And I was teaching nursing students mostly at this time, but they were still interested. You mean all I got to do is cut and paste in Excel? I don't have to program? You'll do that for me, Laura? Sure, I'll help you. And one student turned into 2 students, turned into 4 students, turned into 15 students. And you can see we did posters. We went and presented at regional conferences all over the place. And we had fun doing it. It became a little community. And as more time went on, we started winning awards. My students won awards. I won awards. We went to national conferences and presented. And sooner or later, by 2019, I'm finding myself hanging out at conferences with Nobel Prize winners. This is Frances Arnold. You might have seen her from popular American TV shows like The Big Bang Theory. She actually won the Nobel Prize a couple years ago in chemistry. But anyway, so before I got my PhD last year in May of 2020, 3 weeks into the pandemic, my PhD is in Biomedical Informatics, and it's from Rutgers University. It was done entirely online and is also a mix of computation and experiment looking at antibiotic resistance in Staphylococcus aureus. But anyway, I digress. By the time I had my PhD, I was already on the boards for the American Society of Microbiology. I was listening to Dr. Fauci talk at congressional briefings in the United States about how we deal with the COVID pandemic. I had also received several community honors, like from the Michigan Chamber of Commerce. I was honored as a Lead Like a Woman. I'm also an honorary member of the National Society of Leadership and Success. And of course, Davenport loved me. They were giving me funds for my research now. They were sending me to board meetings. They were giving me teaching and excellence awards. They were writing about me to their alumni. And my students benefited too. So we had countless posters, some nationally presented. We had a couple talks. Again, some of them nationally presented. My students were first and middle authors on 5 papers. And these are peer-reviewed scientific journal papers that was unheard of at Davenport at that time. And here are just some of the many honors that my students won over those years while I was still working on my doctorate. You can see, research keynote speaker, undergraduate poster award winner, student commencement speaker. By the time I graduated with my doctorate, which remember I was never supposed to get because I quit because I had a kid, I was all ready a study director. And then COVID didn't slow me down because I wasn't in the lab anymore. I was in a computer. So I didn't have petri dishes and mice that were dying in a lab that I couldn't get to. I had a computer in my basement. I put my slippers on and I was researching. And my students had laptops. And we would just communicate over the internet like we're doing right now. And even during the pandemic, we were still researching COVID and winning awards for it. Amber, who was my senior researcher at the time, won a national third place award for the work. She presented a poster at the World Microbe Forum, and we've published 2 papers this summer. So computational research complements and can even accelerate wet bench research. So what about the children? I didn't shove them in a closet. I didn't give them away. They've been with me this whole time. In fact, we spent 18 months stuck together while I'm working and they're trying to go to school. And so my kids have got to see this the whole way from a front row seat. And I think that has significantly impacted them. So one question I thought would be helpful to this audience, since you're predominantly women and you may be facing similar challenges, is what do I do with my kid? Well, I really came up with 2 questions. Okay, 3. And they were based out of necessity. 1, can you do it yourself? My oldest kid will tell you, compared to her classmates, she can run a microwave. She can run a stove. She can cook for herself. She understands basic first aid. She's been through CPR training. If I could teach them to do it themselves, that meant they weren't bothering me in the future. And the second question, do you want to help me? Remember, I told my students, hey, if you just start cutting and pasting, I can build you from there. And my kids were no exception. Now, of course, my oldest will remind me there was a third question. The third question was, will you please get me coffee? And yes, I did ask them a lot for coffee, but I mean, come on. So how did this impact my kids? I think it went really well. So here you see my oldest daughter from a couple years ago. Serena found a real passion in computers and biology. And she began working in my Harris Interdisciplinary Research Group in the spring of 2018. You can see her pictured here presenting her poster alongside 2 of my undergraduate students who are also presenting separate posters. Unfortunately, she was accepted, but could not present her poster at the national conference. The conference got canceled because of COVID. And that made her sad, but that did not stop her, as I'll share in a minute. So overall, my goals actually inspire my kids. So what happened during quarantine? We're all stuck together for 18 months. Well, this got interesting because, as I said, I defended my dissertation 3 weeks into quarantine. My kids sat across the table from me while it happened. Then my oldest started asking me, Mom, when is quarantine going to end? When are we going to be able to leave the house again? It's a really good question. I want to know that too. You know what, kid? We can figure that out with math. Here's a logistic regression. You already know linear algebra from Algebra 1. You know what a straight line is. You know what slope is. Let's start building predictive models. So her and I would go through the math and I would teach her the math and we would write a program and look at the data and every day we'd update it. And soon we made a prediction on Facebook. Hey, here's when we think we're coming out of quarantine. And soon her friend who worked for the news, or friend's parent, I should say, that worked for the news, heard about it and wanted to interview me. And then I turned out to be right. Then every time we went back into lockdown, the news would be calling, "Hey, Laura, do you have another prediction?" It got to the point where I said, "I'm not working on that project anymore. I'm sorry. No more predictions on that." But anyway, it taught her valuable math skills, programming skills, and biology skills she uses today. And so as a 14-year-old, ninth grader just entered high school, she's already in pre-calculus. She's a dual enrollment computer science major at the local community college. She's working on a quantum computer programming course with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. All of these things wouldn't have been available if we had to have screwed around with quarantine information. And my youngest is no exception. She's been at the community college gifted and talented education programs. She's been at the National Young Leadership Forum in STEM. And she's looking to go to Michigan State University and be in their gifted and talented program. So I'm not only a good study director, I can be a study director and a good mom. So what am I doing now and where am I going real quick? I know I'm starting to run out of time here. I'm the director of training at ICER. And so my job is split into 3 areas. I do research for about 25% of my time, public outreach like this talk here, and training. And my training involves design and development of courses along with delivering those courses. And they can be courses in anything from bioinformatics to programming to high performance computing. I now have a supercomputer I could log into. That's like 56,000 laptops put together. Super cool. So in research, my goal is to continue being a study director. I now mentor about 40 volunteer researchers every month, and 95% of them are from public outreach programs just like this talk. We have 20 currently active projects, 5 papers in draft, and you can see some of the topics are anything from various types of cancers to different types of neurological diseases. My personal pet, the effects of gravity. So actually looking at how tissue changes expression based on if I'm on the International Space Station or if I'm on Earth. And so my overall goal in research moving forward is to find funding to continue my efforts with a focus on experiential learning in research. So this idea that we're going to use research to learn concepts and contribute to the rest of society. Public outreach, I'd like to inform and inspire not only current but future scientists. To that end, I've given 11 talks since April. You are one of 4 that I've got this month, proud to be here. And I've already talked or reached out to almost 11,000 people. So it's a huge movement bringing people together from the experimental side and the computer side. And I want to increase that effort without increasing the number of talks because I'm already maxed out. For training, I've developed 8 online workshops. Most of them are for MSU personnel only, but some of them are open to the public. And 66% of our trainees are actually from the public, from talks like today. They are free. And I've taught over 400 people this way, and they're generally happy. 4.5 or higher out of 5 want to take another class, or were satisfied with the class they did take. So I want to continue to offer more classes and teach more people. I also want to make sure those that come in complete the course. So my goal overall, my life goal, so to speak, is to grow an educational culture that focuses on research-based experiential learning through computer use. I want people to learn how to use a computer by applying it to a legitimate research question. so they can learn while contributing. And so from my perspective, looking at my career and my kids, I see a very bright future. And so with that said, I can take questions for whatever time we have remaining.